All right. Why don't I get started? I'm David Snead, and I'm a co-founder and board member of the I2 Coalition, and this is the first panel of a series of talks today that is curated by the I2 Coalition, and everyone who is on the panel today is a member of the I2 Coalition. And if you don't know about the I2 Coalition, we're a group of infrastructure providers who are dedicated to keeping the internet awesome. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, how to keep the internet awesome from an international perspective. On the dais today, we have some great international infrastructure providers. On my left, first we have Marco Houwen. Marco is the founder and CEO of LuxCloud and also the co-founder of the DCL Group. LuxCloud, for those of you who don't know, enables people to become cloud services brokers, and LuxCloud has customers on every continent. Next to Marco, we have Alex Joode. Alex is Senior Regulatory Counsel for LeaseWeb, and he's responsible for their global regulatory and public affairs, as well as legal and risk management. LeaseWeb is a global data center provider, and they have data centers in the Netherlands, Germany, and in the US. We also have Todd Mitchell. Todd is Vice President for Strategic Planning from SoftLayer, and he's responsible for identifying emerging markets and new revenue opportunities, as well as strategic corporate planning. SoftLayer has 7 data centers in the US, the Netherlands, and Singapore. And unless you've been under a rock for the last week, SoftLayer was recently acquired by IBM, which we will not be talking about today. Next to Todd is Ben Welch-Bolen. Ben is the co-owner of Site5, and his companies have a completely distributed workforce. Ben he supervises this workforce, and they have more than 18 locations. Each of these guys and their companies are really involved in the I2 Coalition, and if you want to know more about the I2 Coalition, you just go to i2coalition.com. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit with the panelists about policy issues that are involved in international business. We'll do that for about half an hour, and then I'll open up the floor to questions. So if you just start thinking about some policy issues that might be important to you from an international perspective, we'll answer those questions a little bit later. What I'd like to do is like the panelists to think about one question, and we can start with Marco and go down so you get to be in the hot seat today, since you're sitting next to me. All right. The first question is, why did you look beyond your home market, and what was the biggest initial policy challenge you faced, and how did you resolve it?
Well, that's a strange question for a Luxembourgish citizen, because our home market is 500,000 people. So I don't call that a home market when we talk about internet business. So we are naturally drawn in order to get out of the country and really go beyond where we naturally would do it in a country. So that's why LuxCloud decided to go, well, first of all, have a platform or marketplace in Europe, in Luxembourg, but then also go directly to Asia and to Singapore, and go also directly to Brazil, where we are implementing right now. So what is the biggest challenge?
The biggest policy
question. There are so many that it is hard to say which one is the biggest one. I think the biggest challenge we are always facing is how to structure our companies, how to structure it best for an operational point of view, but also for a tax point of view. I think that's where we really have to look into very, very closely. And this is totally different if you talk about going into Asia with a very heterogeneous market than if you go into US. So, yeah.
Okay. Corporate structuring, Alex?
Well, we follow our customers. If there is a customer request for opening a data center in America, we go to America. If your customers are, if our customers want to have a very low latency connection for American audiences, you have to be in America. So we follow them. And our biggest problem was making sure that the liability issues, which are different in Europe than in the US, were tackled. And we did this by making sure we had a separate legal entity operating the American operations.
Okay.
Hey, David. Move the microphone closer. Is it on?
All right. Well, if let us know if you can't hear when Todd starts talking.
Can you hear us all right? Good.
All right. Sorry about that.
Great. So I think everyone knows who SoftLayer is, so I won't go into too much detail there. But regarding policy and international expansion, a couple of years ago, SoftLayer expanded to Asia as well as to Europe, and we faced several new challenges as we looked beyond the borders of the United States. In addition to tax policy, employment issues, as you start to think about data sovereignty is one of the issues that we faced as we looked to Europe and Asia. We looked at IP, so intellectual property rights and regulations, and that helped us determine where we wanted to land. And then I would say last but probably not least is related to internet filtering and licensing in different regions and how that affected our business and our customers' businesses.
All right.
We really followed our customers as well. We're kind of focused on the shared and reseller markets, and about half our customer base was international already. And they really wanted us to offer server locations in a variety of places around the world. In terms of policy, we didn't really evolve our legal structure at this point to go beyond the US. So we more rely on our data center partners in those countries to handle the policy questions, the local policy questions, and then feed those to us. So that really hasn't impacted as much, except for listening to our DC partners, like SoftLayer.
All right. Well, let's Marco and Alex, let's talk a little bit about corporate structuring. Why is corporate structuring important, and how do you make decisions about how you're going to structure your corporation based on policy issues? How does that really affect what you do, and how you tell your lawyers how you need to structure the business?
Well, we looked at the business we have in the Netherlands, which is our origin, and then we took inventory. Okay, what are the problems we see in the Netherlands, and what are the problems which we can expect in the US? We then had legal counsel, and basically the issue was that the Netherlands has a very low. There aren't that many legal court cases, but in the US the liability is much higher. If you do something wrong, the money involved is bigger. So we decided to set up a structure that our assets in the Netherlands and in Europe were shielded from the liability in the States. And that meant that we had a separate legal entity running the American operations, a separate legal entity running the Dutch operations, and a separate legal entity running the German operations. So these are all legal firewalls between the separate entities. So if you rent a server in America, you become a customer of LeaseWeb USA. If you rent a server in the Netherlands, you become customer of LeaseWeb Netherlands. So all the assets and the liabilities are structured in such a way that one legal entity is the key to that asset.
Okay.
For us, as a Dutch company, the lowest liability is in the Netherlands. That means that if you go outside the Netherlands, your liability increases and your risk increases. If you're an American company, the biggest liability you have is in America. So if you go to Europe, it's not necessarily needed to set up a separate legal entity. It just depends on where your base is and where your highest risks are.
Okay. Marco?
Yeah, I think we do it in a similar way. So our operations in Singapore are a full company run in Singapore, owned by LuxCloud Luxembourg. But that's exactly where the challenge is coming in, is when you when you set up a company in the US as a European company, you are giving up, at least subjectively, your freedom from what we call the Patriot Act challenges and so on. David and I, we discussed this in length since several years. So I agree with David that this is a subjective problem, but it is a problem where our customers, especially in Europe, would be very sensitive on. If we would set up a company in the US which would be still drive our European company in the situation to have to give up data for US for the US authorities, this can be a big challenge. So that's why, especially when we talk about setting up from Europe, setting up business in US, you really have to take care about to prove that you are totally independent with your two entities in order not to get into this data challenge where you have to give up or deliver data to Homeland Security or wherever asked.
So Ben, why did you decide not to do what LeaseWeb and LuxCloud have done?
Well, we're a smaller company, so it just didn't make sense at the time. It's something we are looking at doing, but for us, we're just small enough that it didn't impact us.
So you're just insulated from liability by being small?
Yeah, and our DC providers handle a lot of that for us. Since we rent servers and equipment from them in those locales, they kind of feed those through to us. So that kind of protects us.
And so Todd, would you agree with that as a small provider, small providers can rely on the larger providers for that kind of a little bit of insulation?
I think that's a use case question. I mean, clearly we can insulate or help insulate and provide guidance to companies like Ben's.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly if you have questionable content, you'll certainly come under a sort of regulatory fire. And, there's only so much that SoftLayer can do. We can provide guidance. We understand the local markets. But when it comes to regulatory stuff, I think it's important that you understand the liability for your business. Mm-hmm. It's clearly different for everybody. SoftLayer can clearly be at risk for certain things that maybe smaller companies can't be at risk for. But at the end of the day, we're all sort of providing the same level of service, same type of service, and we might end up in the same court if something goes wrong, regardless of size.
So how do you begin to advise your clients or to advise your customers how to parse those regulatory issues? So you each have customers in different locations, and you have to talk to them about it. I mean, from SoftLayer's perspective, how would you begin to advise Ben on what he needs to start thinking about?
Well, I think there's the sort of fundamental question around just corporate structure as a whole, right? And I think we've discussed that at length, but does it make sense to have a U.S. entity operating in Asia, or does it make sense to have an Asian entity operating in Singapore, Hong Kong, what have you, and shielding that potentially from your other entities? There's certainly some risk from some of that rolling uphill because they're wholly owned subsidiaries. People can do the math. They can figure out who owns what. So, there's some protection there, but at the end of the day, they'll figure out who you are. From us, advising our clients, we can talk about regulation all day long. We clearly understand it. Before we go into a market, we spend 8-10 months doing a ton of research. So if a client's interested in where we sort of stubbed our toes, what we learned, we're happy to sit down and talk to them about it. But I think at the end of the day, it's a professional services question. Mm-hmm. You need to sit down with people who understand your business, how you're structured, go speak to your attorneys, go speak to your accountants, and figure out the best structure for you.
So Ben, I mean, how did you do that without the resources that SoftLayer has?
Well, we're just a U.S. entity at this point, so we kind of focus on that market, and we have lawyers in the U.S. who advise us. And then if we do start interacting more with one jurisdiction, we kind of reach out to them and talk to them a little bit, usually informally. And then we also hire a lawyer to kind of advise us in that locale as well. But so far, it's gone pretty well.
So you had a particular experience in India. Talk a little bit about that.
That was actually in the UK.
Okay.
We had this issue where the police force contacted us to serve a warrant but we're not a UK entity, so it created some complication. And we kept referring them back to the DC, like, you need to serve this to the DC. The DC will contact us, and that's how we kind of go about this. And it was really hard for them to understand how that worked, because they look at us and they say, oh, you have servers in the UK. Why can't you do this? Why do we have to go through this hoop? And then even the DC, there was some confusion at the DC as well. And it took like 6 months to sort out, and it ended up being okay. But it definitely, we had to kind of teach them like how that was working, and it ended up okay, but it was definitely a kind of tense time for about 5 months.
Right. So, in terms of law enforcement, I mean, how do you handle those things, Alex? How do you handle subpoenas and warrants and different services of process across jurisdictions?
Well, we have a rule which is, in essence, very simple. The local operating entity only accepts legal papers from a competent authority, and the competent authority can only be the authority in the jurisdiction the company is operating in. So if a German police officer wants something from LeaseWeb USA, he has to file an MLAT with the Americans, and then the Americans will serve the subpoena on LeaseWeb USA. LeaseWeb USA will not give customer data to any police force outside the US.
So for people who don't know, what is an MLAT?
An MLAT is a government-to-government request for help in retrieving data from persons.
Okay. And Marco, how does LuxCloud handle that?
Actually, exactly the same.
Exactly the same. Okay. All right. Well, so in that regard, I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about is corporate structuring. How do you handle customers who want to actually take advantage of the fact that you have distributed data centers? Do you have different contracts for different data centers? How do you handle that?
Well, we have 3 operating companies, so that means that you can become a client of 3 companies. If you want to have a server in Germany, you become a German client, in the Netherlands, and in the US. We have different contracts because the laws are different. Pricing is also different because in America they're using something called the dollar, while in Europe we have the euro. What we see is that a lot of people are searching for the best jurisdiction where they can host their content. In Germany, we once had a company that did reviews of stores. If the review is positive, everything is fine, except not all stores received a positive review. Mm-hmm. That led to legal complaints, and the company asked us, okay, what can we do? And we then said, you're probably better off hosting in the US. So they moved their contract from LeaseWeb Germany to LeaseWeb USA.
So you actually advise your clients where the best jurisdiction for them to be?
We don't advise, we're not a law firm, so we don't give them legal advice. We just tell them it might be better for you to go to the States. Okay. And if they follow up on that, that's fine.
So do all 4 of you have separate contracts for each jurisdiction, or do you have an MSA that someone can sign, just put data wherever they want?
So from a SoftLayer perspective, we don't overly expose our different entities, right? You go to softlayer.com, you'll sign up. Depending on your billing address, where you want servers, et cetera, it determines on the back end what entity you actually are doing business with. Our master service agreement will represent that, et cetera. So we actually don't expose our legal entities at all to our clients. We don't advise them on doing business in certain areas or not based on their content. Similar to the guys to my right here, we're not a law firm. We don't want to get into the business of providing advice. It's just that would be a little bit foolish of us. But yeah, we don't expose any of that to our clients, okay, unless they ask, but it's very seldom that they actually ask.
And Marco, do you have customers who ask that question?
Well, we have customers who are in Europe and who are also with entities in Singapore. They sign up with our European entity and with our Singaporean entity, and get in the essence of the content the same contract, but it is always adapted to Luxembourgish European Union law and Singaporean law. That's what we are doing.
Okay. So, Todd, yesterday you were talking a little bit about why SoftLayer isn't in China, and you were talking a bit about content filtering and the fact that the how that's done in China isn't transparent. And how do you evaluate that from country to country? Because I know that every country has laws that people find objectionable for one reason or another.
Right. And China isn't the only country that's doing filtering, right? We can't have our blinders on there. Singapore recently announced that they'll do some filtering around news sites, and you'll have to get a license to actually just post daily news. Malaysia does some content filtering as well. Obviously, China is perhaps the most well-known from a content filtering perspective. It's a touchy subject. I think that it's very prevalent. Everyone understands that it happens, but it's difficult to manage because you can't really get any information from anyone on how it works, how you get stuff tagged, how you get stuff untagged. It's really quite interesting. So we continue to struggle with that. We obviously know that China's a huge market. There's a lot of content there. There's a lot of users. There's potentially a lot of revenue. But we struggle with the expense of going to China. The internet connectivity in and out of China is very expensive because there's only a couple of content or IP providers in and out. And then it's just whether or not the content will be able to leave mainland China.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about those laws. One of the things that I hear about all the time is the impact that U.S. Laws, how they affect my clients and how they cause people from outside the U.S. to host elsewhere. So the most notorious is, of course, the Patriot Act. So Marco, talk a little bit about the Patriot Act and how LuxCloud approaches that.
Well, I will give you a very subjective view of that, because I said already before, objectively there are the same subset of regulations from the EU to US. So the challenge is actually the same, but it's more about a very subjective feeling of European customers having their data in the US, and some very not clearly formulated or supported by jurisprudence supported decisions that if you have the right to put your data into US companies. So we're not talking about end users, we're not talking about retail, I really talk about SMBs, about companies who don't have the possibility really to analyze this and to hire 15 lawyers to find out what's best for them. They just have a subjective feeling. So talking about this subjective feeling, you really have this on different levels in the different countries in Europe. So in Germany, for example, there's a very, very tough thinking that data has to stay in Germany, and otherwise this makes no sense. If you talk about UK or even Netherlands, you have this way less. So this is really a very subjective approach. So I have to be very honest. We are marketing this in Europe the best way we can in order to play around to get our customers and keep them in Europe and keep them as a customer of ours. So as we are selling through partners only, so our partners or these can be telcos, hosters, or value-added resellers. These guys are then, selling the Patriot Act free solutions to their customers. So yeah, that's how. So
you would say you would look at it as more of a marketing issue than necessarily a law enforcement issue.
Well, with recent events, if you would have asked me this, 2 months ago, I would have said totally yes.
Okay.
I don't say yes now because I think with recent events, things. It's a game changer. What happened 2-3 weeks ago, and we really have to assess the whole landscape new in the next few weeks and months, and see how also the public acceptance will affect maybe the whole cloud idea through what happened. So we have to see what happens.
So Ben, have you done any thinking about this, kind of from a small to medium-sized enterprise perspective, kind of about the Patriot Act and then about kind of recent revelations?
Yep. We have about 45,000 clients in small business and so on, and we don't see many questions from them at all. I think we get about one a month, if anything. And on the recent stuff with the NSA, we had one person, basically ask us, does we ever give anything out without a warrant or anything like that? So we just see nothing on the bottom. Like, just people don't seem to ask us. The only people that seem to ask a lot, we get a lot of inquiries from Australians. Has been a big one. Their media really focused, I think, last year a lot on the Patriot Act and so on, and it raised a lot of awareness. So that's it. It's pretty quiet. Interesting.
And Alex, I mean, how are you thinking about the PRISM stuff?
Well, we received a lot of questions when we opened our American office. Now, LeaseWeb is part of the Patriot Act, and all our data is suddenly insecure. So we had to retain counsel and write a fact sheet for our customers. Now, with the recent PRISM stuff, we had to redo this. The initial reports were that the NSA basically had a switch port which copied all the data. Right. Most of the people are not that technical, so for them, they have no idea how the internet works and how you do it, and they think everybody has installed some sort of backdoor, so the Americans can take all the data they want, which is not the case. From the presentations I saw yesterday, I think it's a bit of a hype. Yes, there is data access, but there also is data access within Europe. Using the MLAT procedures, the Americans can get access to European data. The difference is that when there is an MLAT, and you can go to court and fight against exporting the data to the US, while the whole PRISM and Patriot Act stuff, that's secret. You don't know if your data has been copied.
So, I mean, from that perspective, and from what you're hearing from your customers, what's the impact that these revelations are going to have on global businesses? The supposed promise of the cloud is that your business, your data is portable anywhere, and now, I mean, how is that going to affect your business?
I think that there will be some people that are interested in the global cloud, but there will be a lot of Europeans that are interested in a non-American wiretapped cloud.
That's kind of a loaded answer.
But that's what we see, and that's what we hear from our European customers.
So
whether or not they're right, it's something we can give them.
So what's interesting to me, at least from my biased perspective, is that there's not a discussion about how European laws impact data collection. So if you look at the laws that are present in Europe, there are laws that are, in some respects, even more aggressive than the Patriot Act. So why is there a focus so much on? Is it just because the Patriot Act is so appropriately named, or?
Well, Europeans see it as collecting data, which isn't. There is no reason for it. I mean, most Europeans aren't terrorists. We have no interest in harming the states. If you look at European privacy law, they're now discussing the law that if you export data, you can have a fine of 2% of your worldwide turnover. But also, they have this issue, if there is European client data somewhere in the world, it should be covered by European privacy laws. So there is this whole difference between what you expect as protection. We want to have European law globally for our privacy stuff. But if there is intelligence gathering, that cannot be done.
So that's, I mean, from a legal perspective, that's a really interesting concept, right? So you have European privacy law govern the data wherever it is. So essentially, Europe is creating a global privacy standard, at least supposedly only for their own citizens, right? I mean, how would you handle that, Todd, just kind of from a compliance perspective, where you have laws that are attaching to data wherever SoftLayer puts it?
Right. You know, I think that probably affects our clients more than it does us. We clearly have data in different jurisdictions, and we understand how that's governed. Our clients are obviously a little bit different. If they're based in the EU and they put data in Singapore, clearly that new regulation might make a lot of sense for them. I think our clients, our more sophisticated clients, take a little bit of a different approach, where they start to use encryption to handle a lot of their data as they understand the risk around the world. It's often difficult to understand who has access to your data. I mean, clearly the NSA stuff this week or last week has blown open, you know, some of the visibility into how that operates. I don't think this is going to be the last that we hear about it, and it's certainly not going to be restricted to the United States. I'm certain that this is prevalent, you know, across the world. But our more sophisticated clients use encryption, right? And so whether it's storing data, whether it's moving data between sites, whether it's delivering data to clients using, you know, SSL certs and what have you. So they take their own steps to ensure that their data is as secure as they can make it. And certainly using strong encryption will ensure that the wrong people won't see your data.
I think that's just one of the unintended effects of all this. The encryption, moving towards encryption is going to make it almost impossible for law enforcement to actually get access to this data in the long run.
That's right. I mean, there's tons of processing power today, so there's little overhead to encrypt and decrypt data, so they can move it easily, they can do it on the fly. So it will make it a little bit more difficult for law enforcement, which might not be a bad thing.
So Ben, I mean, how would you deal with this kind of customers saying, all right, I want this law to attach to the data around the world?
Yeah, we tell them that we're a U.S. legal entity and that that's really what is applicable, and they need to talk to a lawyer beyond that. We keep it pretty simple at this point, and I mean, 99% of our customers are individuals or small businesses, so they're more focused on growing their business. The legal questions don't come up as often. So it really isn't something we hear a lot. I mean, we don't have, you know, like giant clients. You know, the biggest clients we have, you know, have 10 employees and they're running a small SaaS application or something like that. So it just is very rare to hear about.
And they don't necessarily say, all right, well, we have clients all over the place. I mean, how are you going to handle legal issues for us? They just
no. They're more concerned about how we're going to serve their website faster. You know, help their business. It's really not ever brought up.
Okay. All right. So we have about 10 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? I have a bunch more questions I can ask, but does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Wow. All right. Yep, Kurt.
Just, you know, there's a lot of focus on the U.S., the Patriot Act, and all, and even with the new prison things. I think it's got to be fair to assume that every country has their own national intelligence information gathering. So it's a matter of, you know, how do you deal with it internally, like in Europe? I'm sure that Scotland Yard and all the other intelligence, MI6 and MI5 and in the UK, and I mean, I'm sure that every country has these. I mean, is it just ignored? I mean, obviously they have some of the same powers because Europe has been dealing with terrorism for far longer than the United States has. So why is this being just touted as such a big issue in the U.S.? Okay, we got caught with our pants down, let's say, but it's happening everywhere. So I mean, is there recognition of that in Europe?
As said before, I think it's a very subjective subject. So if you have a European seeing what happens in the US, this will enforce their will of not having data when they have already this decision. This will enforce the decision not having the data in the US. In Europe, yes, I think UK is actually very nicely involved in the whole PRISM discussion, and that is openly discussed right now, actually, with the G8 right now in Belfast, where actually they are fighting around that on the highest level. But I just have to say, come to Luxembourg. I can assure you that our intelligence service is not able to handle that. I know the guys who are doing it. They are good, but they don't have the means to do that. So if you want to store your data, come to Luxembourg.
I mean, you know, from my perspective, it often seems to be kind of the devil that you know. So in Europe, people seem to be used to the laws that, for example, RIPA in the UK. They seem to be used to those laws that have passed their subjective kind of communal shield, right? And then they look more at the US, where the laws are different and where we've made different choices, and it looks threatening. And I often see that as kind of an explanation for why, for example, the Germans aren't concerned about their particular laws that allow warrantless access to data. I mean, does it seem to be a cultural thing to anyone on the panel?
I mean, we published a transparency report, like Google, Microsoft, and Twitter. In 2012, we had 8 government requests here in America. We had 45 in the Netherlands and 233 in Germany. These were all police requests. We haven't had any contacts or requests from intelligence services. So you can see that, yes, there are differences. Germany is a very high proportion of the regulatory requests we receive. Why is that? I have no idea. Maybe they are more active, they have a bigger police force. Something different might be in our network there. I don't know.
It just seems that's an interesting statistic. So you got far fewer requests from U.S. law enforcement, and yet everybody's making a bigger deal about U.S. law enforcement action.
I think it has all to do with how privacy is perceived in Europe and how privacy is perceived in the US. So the European legislators try to put the privacy of anybody at the highest level, and this is not the case in the US. At least that is how it is marketed in Europe. So if you talk then about data having it in US, and if you talk about ERP, CRM data running in US for small and mid-sized business companies, as said before, who cannot afford lawyers to really go into depth of that question, then it's only taking over this, as often said, subjective way of seeing things.
Okay. Yep.
I have a question. So we talked a lot about the differences in the different markets. My question is, would you want it to be the same everywhere in the world?
So the question is, would it be easier if we had a homogeneous environment? Who wants to take that? Do you want to take that?
I'll take it. I mean, that would clearly be the panacea if we could, all sit in a room and hash out the, page-long document on how we handle data and law enforcement requests and what have you. I think that's going to be the same time where we see unicorns and double rainbows in the same room. So it would certainly make sort of, handling those requests easier. I can't imagine that ever happening in the near future. I mean, we all deal with government. I think there's too much bureaucracy and people have too many interests.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I could imagine it happening either, but I'm saying that it's actually, in a way, it gives you some marketing position, right? And you kind of alluded to it earlier, that it can be an advantage to be able to offer people different geographies and so on. Just wondering, what would the trade-off of having the ease of administration outweigh the benefit of having marketing benefit?
So is that something that you would suggest might be negotiated in a treaty?
Oh, I have no suggestions for how.
You can't just ask questions and not have answers.
I mean, if you look at Europe, we're 27 countries. There is the European Union, but still it's 27 different countries with 27 different legal regimes and 27 different cultural regimes. And that's only in Europe, a area which has been working together for the past 40 to 50 years. If you want to do that on a global level, I think that's mission impossible.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, so yeah.
Actually, I'm from China. When you just mentioned about marketing of China, what I'm thinking is, do you have any idea if
So the question is, would it, for China specifically, can you work with a partner there to understand the laws in China and content filtering? But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to make that question a bit broader and say, can you deal with legal compliance by and these different legal or say law enforcement compliance issues by actually essentially partnering with someone in the local jurisdiction? Do you want to, Ben, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we've thought about this at some point, but we've also been afraid because there's a lot of stories about companies that have partnered up locally and it hasn't worked out long term for cultural differences, not really understanding the market, you know, and some other things, especially with regard to the enforceability of laws inside of China, especially for international companies. So it's something we're watching real closely, but that we are waiting to see, especially what the larger DC groups do over time. And for now, we kind of stay on the outskirts. You know, we look at Hong Kong or Singapore. But yeah, that's why we've avoided it for now.
I honestly think if LuxCloud decides to go into China, we would for sure do this with a local partner, because I think it's too hard of a hassle to make it for a relatively small organization to make it through the compliance and legal approaches in China, for sure.
So I mean, in general, would that be a business approach that, say, smaller companies can take? I mean, would that be something that you'd advise, that you can go and maybe find us a local partner and be a host in the U.S. and then, say, open a branch in China by using a local partner?
I think that everybody has to take the decision for his own. It's quite a business related and a question where everybody strategically has to decide if he wants to go with a partner or not. So that's really the DNA of a company, how they want to handle that. From my perspective, I'm rather going into markets with a partner than not going into a market. So that's my point of view.
Okay. Does anyone else have an opinion about partnering? All righty then. All right. Any other questions? Okay. If y'all would join me in thanking our panelists for being here, and thank you all for coming.